Brilliant. We are live. There we go. So welcome to the first Mind Warrior show of the new year. So happy new year to viewers and happy new year to Kevin. It's a really good show to start the new year. I'm joined by guest Kevin O Doherty, whose career is really interesting with its focus on understanding mental wellbeing and the psychology of people. So hi and welcome, Kevin. Before we go into the
thank
show,
you very much.
Thank you. Before we go into the show, I'm going to play the opening short film, and then we'll have proper introductions afterwards. So I'll just click this and we'll speak afterwards. Great. So welcome again. And I've just got a quick reminder for anyone watching live that you can put any questions in the chat. If you're watching on YouTube, that is. If you're watching via Facebook or LinkedIn, I can't see you as viewers or see the comments. So if you log in via YouTube, then I can ask any chats to Kevin as we go. So welcome, Kevin. We've already had a chat. So I'm kind of aware a bit more about your work, but it'd be great if you could introduce yourself and talk about what you do a little bit for our viewers and for anyone that's listening back.
Yeah, sure. So I'm Kevin O Doherty. I'm a psychologist. I'm a CBT therapist. Most of the work these days is in expert witness work. And that basically, in a nutshell, is where, for example, solicitors want a psychological assessment of one of their clients for whatever reason. And they come to somebody like me and say, could you do an assessment and write a report for this person that will help in his or her case in the courts or with immigration services, for example. So I do a very kind of varied psychological assessment for the individual and write a report. And then that goes to the solicitor or sometimes the barrister, and it's used as evidence in the court or immigration tribunals. And it's basically just it's a psychological assessment, and it's my opinion as to what this person has been through in the past, what they're experiencing at the moment, and perhaps what they're likely to experience in the future if, for example, they're sent to prison, if, for example, they're deported, if, for example, they have to go back to living with an abusive partner somewhere or other. So it's looking at a prognosis for the future as well.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And what other factors do they take into consideration? So it's your kind of assessment, and how much weight does that hold compared to what else they look at?
I think typically in, for example, asylum immigration cases, my assessment and report probably likely plays a small part in the overall case. So solicitors and barristers will gather together lots of pieces of evidence, GP medical records, home office documentation, the psychological assessment, psychiatric assessment, a whole range of evidence they gather together. And I think mine plays a small but relevant part in all of that.
Yeah.
So, for example, if a client typically was tortured or abused back home in their country on the grounds of sexuality, their politics, their religion, for example, my assessment would look at that in depth, and I'd write a report to describe how that has impacted this person and how it's likely to impact them if they're forced to return to that country. So I think it plays a very valid part in the overall case.
Yeah. So you look at their current well-being as well as the future. If they were to go back into that situation, what impact it would have on them. So what kind of areas do you look into to determine the well-being of someone and also that kind of like future well-being?
Sure. Well, when I receive a referral from solicitors, they usually send me lots of different documents, and if they don't, I often request various documents, like if the person is registered with a GP, I ask for a copy of their medical records, copy of Home Office documents, copy of documents from back home. In asylum cases as well, there's a British government website where anybody can log on to actually and find out what's going on in various countries around the world in terms of dealing with religious issues, where somebody gives up on their original religious background, or, for example, how women might be treated in that country if they divorce their husbands or try to divorce their husbands. So I gather that evidence as well. A whole range of evidence I take into account.
And what do you typically see from these different types of trauma or events? What do you typically see the impact is on people?
Yeah, I mean, it really does vary. And obviously there are a lot of factors involved. What's happened to the individual? When did it happen? Over what period of time was it happening? And and who was doing, the abuse or the torture or the the treatment that's not so nice. But typically people experience PTSD very often when they've been through these experiences. They will likely have flashbacks, sleep problems, nightmares, and real vivid nightmares where they're kind of almost back in their home country, going through these experiences all over again. Often I think as a kind of a protective factor, people with PTSD often develop a kind of a numbness where they don't feel anything. And you can imagine that has good survival value. If you've been experiencing dreadful trauma, for your body or your mind to use that as a defense mechanism is actually quite useful for a period of time. But in the longer term, it's perhaps not so useful.
They can just stay withdrawn, I guess, from relationships, from community, from life.
People often socially isolate themselves. They'll stay away from anybody they see as being in a position of authority. They might stay away from family members. They might close down their email and telephone accounts, for example, give up on their friends, stay at home, socially isolate themselves. Sometimes they might develop agoraphobia, where they feel intense anxiety and panic if they go outdoors, so they feel that it's safer to stay at home. So it really can impact on people. Trauma really does impact on people, and it's so important for people to be assessed, to have their stories heard, and also hopefully to get some kind of help, support and intervention as well.
And do you find that this does kind of help them as well, having their story told and kind of talking it through with someone, the sort of process that you go through with them, does that kind of help move them on their journey as well of healing?
I think it really does. And although sometimes during the assessment, obviously as a professional, I'm very tactful and careful about how I word my questions, I explain to them at the beginning that, I'm sorry if any of the questions that I'm going to ask you remind you of some of the things that have happened, but it's really important that I get a really good overview of what has happened and how it's impacted on you, because then I'm much more able to help you in the case that is being put together. So typically where people have experienced trauma and I have to assess that and write a report, some of the questions that I ask do elicit unpleasant memories, and people can get quite emotional and upset, and it's important for me to give them time to express that during the assessment. But most often at the end of the assessment, people will often say, thank you so much. I think that's probably the first time that somebody has just given me the space to let it all out. And I'm sorry that I swore a few times, because I was angry about the situation I was in the past. And I said, no problems at all. I totally understand. I really do. But people are happy that they can at least just let it all out, even for an hour or so whilst they're being assessed. And just to have their story heard, I think it's so validating and so empowering for individuals to have their their story heard.
Yeah, to be listened to. And I think, that's one of the ethos of the mental health warriors, is that it's a community, that there's support, and there's, to just reach out at any time when you're struggling. Because even if, what people can do is just listen, that does make such a difference, doesn't it? So, and I'm a firm believer in what I do as well, in sort of mindset coaching and hypnotherapy, that there's always hope for change. There's always hope for improving your mental well-being from wherever you are, with the right support, and with that sort of support around you. And is that something that you look into in those assessments, thinking about if you're sending someone back somewhere, or changing their environment? Do you look into, well, what support would they have there? Because it's really critical that we do have that around us.
Absolutely. And unfortunately, in some parts of the world, mental health or mental illness is not recognized in the same way that we understand it and recognize it here in the West, and there are lots of taboos and negative stereotypes about people with mental illness, mental health issues. But I help and I advise people towards the end of the assessment. I have a whole list of different helping and support organizations that help clients who, for example, speak Arabic or Hindi or Gujarati, or who are bisexual, transsexual, gay, transgender, for example. And I have a whole list of helping organizations. And I always make the point to almost everybody that I do an assessment for who have experienced trauma, I always kind of bring the assessment to a close diplomatically. Now I say it's so important to talk and to express and to get support with the issues that you're going through. Thank you very much for sharing your story. I feel so kind of appreciative and honored that you have shared that with me. I'll do my very best for you, but please don't stop there. Reach out to some of these organizations and keep on talking, keep on sharing. And it's so healthy to do that. It really is.
Yeah, I bet the difference you make in just doing that is quite unbelievable, actually. So, but because they also won't know what they don't know. They maybe don't know where to go. So if you to just say there's these groups, there's these organisations, they're like, right, I can start with that as well. I feel like they're still progressing on their journey of getting better. There's a couple of questions that come up in the comments. I'm going to go back to Adam's in a bit when we're talking about the sort of training. So that was on the CBT and sort of the difference between EMDR. But Hannah's got a question there saying, really interesting discussion so far. For you, Kevin, not sure how much you're involved in post-assessment, but do you find there's a sufficient level of support or intervention in the system currently?
For post-assessment, I guess Hannah means after I've done my assessment, what happens after that?
Yeah.
I mean, in my expert witness, the work that I do as an expert witness, it's kind of vital for me to be impartial and independent. So I'm kind of instructed by lawyers or solicitors to gather this evidence together and then complete the report and send it to them. And it's important, in a sense, it's important for me to sever the links there so that I'm not personally involved in any of the cases. I have to be seen to remain impartial and independent. So personally, I don't get involved with clients after assessment, but I certainly do always send them information. If I think there's an organization that can help and support them, I send that to them and I urge them to get in touch.
Yeah, definitely. Something else I wanted to touch on was another piece of your work, because what you do is really varied, and that's the psychological autopsies, which I think is really fascinating. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about what that involves, and sort of typically what you see in their mental well-being sort of after their life?
Yeah, sure. So I became interested in psychological autopsies a number of years ago when I was putting together some of my courses that I have on Udemy. And some of those courses are around psychological profiling in criminology cases. And doing the research for some of those courses, I came across psychological autopsies. And it kind of intrigued me, and I read a bit more. And then I did a lot more reading on it. And then I thought I should do a course on this. I should get the accredited training in it. So I attended training for psychological autopsies, and it's absolutely fascinating. It was something that I hadn't really looked at
Yeah.
before in any great detail. But basically, what happens in a psychological autopsy is very similar to a physical autopsy, where physical medical doctors will examine the body of a deceased to see what physical factors may have played a part in their demise. A psychological autopsy does the same thing, but from a psychological perspective. So what we do is we gather lots of evidence. Typically, we're instructed to work on a case, and we go back in time. So from the point where the person passed away, oftentimes by suicide, unfortunately, and we backtrack and gather lots of evidence from the preceding 12 months before they
Mm.
died by suicide. We gather medical records, we speak to family members, employers, toxicology reports, the physical autopsy reports, the coroner's notes. So we gather lots of evidence like this. And the idea is that whoever has instructed us, they want to know what led up to this person deciding to take their own life, for example, what psychological factors may have played a part. And
Mm.
so we're kind of turning back the time, really. We're looking at the past 12 months. It's a retrospective assessment and report of this person's life, of their behavior, of their emotions. And yeah, so we gather lots of evidence to do that.
And it must be
And there are
quite
some
a lot
very,
of,
yeah,
I was going to say, it must be quite a lot of evidence as well, because normally you can, right, you need to understand someone's thought process, their beliefs about themselves and where their life is, but you can't speak to that person. So, you know, if you're not able to get that, I guess you're going to have to speak to a lot of people to get a very rounded view.
yeah, that's right. Absolutely. And in a sense, the more people, the better. And the more pieces of evidence, the better. It's almost like being a detective. You know, you gather lots and lots of evidence, but you do have to draw the line somewhere. You know, you can't go on for forever and ever. But once we feel as if we've gathered enough evidence to give an independent opinion that is valid and reliable and as accurate as we can be, bearing in mind we're looking at past events rather than present, ongoing events, and then we put together that report, and it has a great deal of value
Yeah.
also. For example, for family members, employers, and friends of the deceased, who are often left with lots of questions, unanswered questions, when somebody they know decided to take their life. And the psychological autopsy oftentimes will help to answer some of those questions and even help to bring closure for those affected, those
Mm.
remaining behind, you know.
Yeah. And
So,
from your
yeah.
experience in this, do you tend to see a kind of a gradual decline in their mental well-being, or is there certain milestones? Do there tend to be sort of certain trends that you see in all these cases, or can they be really varied?
They can be quite varied. There are some patterns, of course. It can be a general decline in the person's mental health and well-being. But sometimes it's a very sudden life event that happens for the individual. It can be a diagnosis of a very serious physical illness, for example. It
Mm.
can be the ending of a relationship. It can be deceased, the passing away of a loved one, for example. So it tends to be one or the other. It tends to be either a gradual general decline in the person's mental health and well-being, or it can be several uh, uh, very significant life events that have
Yeah,
really, you know, knocked the person for six, and
yeah,
that are difficult for any of us to cope with.
yeah. Has there been any sort of surprise learnings for you from, you know, your time either on psychological assessments or on the autopsies? What's your kind of biggest learnings or things that you've been surprised about?
Um, Several things. I think I'm always learning, always,
Mm.
always. I never get to the point where I think, oh, here we go, another assessment. And I never get to that point, because from I can put my hand on my heart, but each and every person that I speak to and do an assessment for, whether that's a psychological autopsy for somebody who is no longer around, or a psychological report for somebody with an immigration issue. I'm always learning a great deal about human nature, human behavior, human resilience, the amount of kind of help and support that is out there, and if only people reach out for it. And that's the crucial thing. Sometimes people don't feel able to reach out to grasp at the help and support that's out there, or sometimes they don't know the amount of help and support that is out there. So it's difficult to pinpoint the things that I've learned, because there are so many of them, and I'm still learning all the time, and please God, I'll keep on learning right up until my time comes.
And I think it's just, you were saying, hand on heart, you don't feel like, oh, here's another one, because you must feel like you're adding so much value at the end. It's either closure for the friends and family, or it's help with, whoever's going through this. So, is there been any other of your beliefs that have changed about mental well-being from your experience? Have you changed any of your beliefs?
Well, in the very early days, I think quite a number of years ago, I was probably in my early 20s when I first started to study psychology. To be honest, I used to think back then, I'm talking more than 30 years ago, I used to have almost a prejudice, I guess, back then, that people with mental health issues were somehow different to the rest of us. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Whereas I've learned some very valuable lessons over the years, and I've learned that all of us, every single one of us, have mental health needs. And every single one of us at some point in our life will suffer from mental illness, distress, anxiety, sleepless nights, depression, even. And it's absolutely normal, when we go through certain life events, to experience the emotions attached to those significant life events. And I guess that's the greatest thing that I've learned, is that all of us have mental health needs and issues from time to time.
Yes, and it is very much, everyone's on a roller coaster in their life, aren't they? There's times where you need that support, and then there's times when people can more lean on you. So it's absolutely, it's all about the community, and that's the kind of mental health warriors as well. It's always, there's people out there, reach out. This is a community. Even if you don't know where you can turn, someone will know. So just reach out and speak to someone. And, just reaching out, speaking, someone listening to you helps. And also they'll be able to kind of say, well, have you spoken to this person, or kind of, give you, it's the worst thing is to just feel like you haven't got anyone to speak to, because that's really tough, isn't it?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I could share a brief story there if I could as well.
Yes,
quite a number of years ago, in my teenage years, I lived in a tower block. I think it was on the 18th floor, in a very deprived part of Birmingham. And for 12 months, I was unemployed. A very difficult time in my life. But I had 2 dogs, and at the time, and they really were my savior back then. And even now, sometimes I say thank you to the both of them. They're no longer with us. But oftentimes I would talk to my dogs, and I'd talk to them about the stresses and strains of the day, my worries and concerns. And obviously they never responded verbally anyway, but they were excellent listeners. And that's the crucial thing, is feeling that you're being listened to. If it's a dog, a budgie, a cat, whomever, the milkman, whomever, just to feel that you're expressing this stuff and it's being listened to.
Someone cares.
And it worked wonders. Somebody cares. And my dogs really cared. And they never betrayed my trust. They never told any secrets to anybody else.
They're good at that, aren't they? No, they're really good at that. I wanted to sort of jump back to Adam's question at the beginning. So I really wanted to talk about your training as well through Udemy. So you've got lots of courses. I think, are they all online? So all online courses on there, all around sort of mental health. I mean, I had a look before. There's one's on personality disorders. We've got a question about that in a minute, so I'll bring that up. Self-harm, sort of general mental mental awareness training, eating disorders, PTSD, anxiety, OCD, so a number of different courses. And just to start CBT as well, which is Adam's point at the beginning. So I wanted to sort of talk a little bit more about those courses, but Adam had a question at the start about explaining CBT. So I thought maybe you could do that and how it affects us. And what's the difference between CBT and EMDR? So I guess that's the rapid eye movement. But if you wanted to have a chat about, CBT, that'd be good.
Sure, yeah. So CBT, in a nutshell, was devised by somebody called Dr. Aaron Beck. He was a psychiatrist in the 1960s, an American psychiatrist. And he was, apparently, the story goes, he was practicing as he was as a psychiatrist, as a psychoanalyst. But he noticed quite a lot of his patients weren't recovering from depression-related symptoms. And he also began to note that many of them were thinking in very depressed ways and ways that were not helpful or constructive. And he began to develop techniques at challenging those ways of thinking and helping his clients to find alternative, more helpful ways of thinking. And hey presto, he noted a lifting of the mood for these clients. So he kind of developed it from there. It's basically CBT, cognitive behavior therapy, focuses on helping the individual to understand their emotions, to express how they've been feeling, the difficulties that they're going through at the moment, and then helps them to look at various behaviors that are not serving a very constructive purpose, that are not helping them. And also any thoughts, any ways of thinking habits that are making the person feel more depressed or more anxious than otherwise would be the case. And the idea is that we gradually help the person to find, identify more helpful, constructive ways of thinking, more helpful, constructive ways of behaving, so as to minimize the anxiety, sometimes to get rid of the anxieties or the depression, or whatever the emotional issue is. It's very different. It's quite different to positive thinking. In CBT, we prefer to call it helpful, constructive thinking rather than positive.
Yeah.
Basically, because it's more realistic. Positive thinking can be realistic in some situations, but the future doesn't always feel bright for people. You know. So I guess CBT helps people to find more helpful, constructive ways of thinking and behaving.
Yeah, it's a real kind of self-awareness piece, isn't it? It's a real self-awareness, and then kind of just being curious about whether there's another way of thinking, rather than going, you've got to be positive. You've got to think positive about this. It's just being about curious about, or challenging the way that you're thinking, and then just being curious if there's another possible way. It's I think it's really valuable. Yeah, really valuable.
Because I think also if somebody, for example, is feeling low in mood, if somebody else comes along and says, come on, cheer up, think positive, it can be quite invalidating and quite disempowering for that individual, because they feel as if they're not being taken seriously. Their feelings are not being kind of, dealt with very well. Whereas if we help the person gradually to perhaps begin to explore different ways of thinking, or try behavioral strategies to help alleviate the depression, that's much more helpful, because then we're working with the person rather than just telling them what to do.
Yeah, and then how they're getting it wrong. It's kind of like you're getting it wrong if you're not thinking positively, which can have a bigger impact, can't it? So, and I wanted to pick up on because I think. Kat's got a question there on personality disorder. She's actually saying about treating with hypnosis, but I wanted to speak to you about, you've got one of your courses, haven't you, on personality disorders, I think. So what's your thoughts on treatment for that? Or is the course a sort of general awareness? Or have you got thoughts on how that can be treated as well and supported?
I mean, the course is general awareness. Most of my courses on Udemy are general awareness, kind of introductory level courses in that topic. And the same is the case with personality disorders. So in that course, I talk about what personality disorders are, how they tend to be assessed, what some of the symptoms are, and how we kind of categorize them, or how psychiatrists categorize them into different kind of labels, depending on the symptoms that the person's going through.
Yeah.
In terms of treatment, I think, to be fair, personality disorders are very varied. There's a wide range, a wide number of different personality disorders. And we know that CBT has been shown to be effective in treating personality disorders, but there's a lot more to it than that. And I think, to be fair, combined with perhaps prescribed medication, developing a good social support network, CBT, perhaps other kinds of talking therapies are certainly helpful.
Yeah.
CBT or any other psychological intervention, it's not the be all and end all for any mental health issue. For some people, it works very well. For other people, might prefer some different kind of help, support, or intervention. So it really does vary. It's difficult to say this treatment is the best for this issue.
It depends on the person, doesn't it? I think Adam's popped a question here about, from a psychological perspective, why do you believe we allow our inner demons to control our mindset? So I guess that's kind of, I've seen that with CBT as well, or, or anyone that's kind of struggling with that inner narrative, why do you believe that we kind of allow ourselves?
I mean, from a typical CBT perspective, it's that our experiences have led us to develop a number of core beliefs, very often going way back to our childhoods, if we've experienced trauma or abuse or neglect, for example, or financial poverty, for example, as children. We develop some core beliefs around that. And these core beliefs develop over the long period. Some core beliefs, thankfully, are very helpful and constructive, and they help us to make sense of the world. Whereas other core beliefs, although they helped us perhaps get through that difficult experience as a child, in the longer term, when we move into adult life, for example, those core beliefs are perhaps not as helpful. Think of core beliefs as habitual ways of thinking, really. So just like with physical habits, some physical habits are not helpful for us. Smoking cigarettes, for example. Sorry if that upsets anybody, but we know that smoking cigarettes is not a helpful habit for our physical health. Very similar for mental health as well. There are a number of habits and habitual ways of thinking and behaving that we know are not helpful and constructive. I wonder if that answered this question.
Yeah, and I think so. In my experience working with clients, though, that kind of like that inner demon, that inner critic, that voice, it isn't yours. It's actually exactly what you said. It's a teacher from when you were younger. It's a parent. It's and when we're told those things when we're young, we think that adults know everything, and then we start to take that as truth, and then that just sort of rolls around in our head. We keep it going, and then that's what shapes our belief system, isn't it? So it's it can just be. It can literally be experiences from when you're younger, and sometimes it can be throwaway comments that just stay in your mind. And then because we have that kind of tendency to look to reaffirm those beliefs, we then grow up reaffirming those beliefs, and then it becomes stronger and stronger in our minds, doesn't it? So
that's right. That's absolutely right. Absolutely right. And I think one that stuck with me over time was the idea of wanting something. And when I was a child, teachers would often say to children, "I want never gets." So now I understand what they were meaning by that. They were meaning, if you say, "Could I have this, please?" then you're more likely to get it. But as a child, I interpreted that as meaning, so that means that whatever I want in life, I can't have.
I remember hearing that.
It's wrong to want something.
Yeah. Yeah. I know. It's just some of these sayings. It's like when you actually think about them as an adult. I wanted to sort of just tie up with the training, but just before I sort of close it on there was one other comment from Hannah about the percentage of psychological autopsies. So have you found the percentage of psychological autopsies are mostly upon individuals with previous mental health diagnosis, or nothing. So therefore they've never accessed support. So that's really interesting. You know, when you see this, is there any evidence anywhere that these people who have perhaps taken their own lives, unfortunately, have sought help beforehand, or do you tend to see that there's, you know, there hasn't been that reaching out?
Yeah, I mean, I've only done about, I think since I did the training, I've probably done about 15 of them, quite extensive psychological autopsies. So it's not a very, you know, it's not a very large number to comment on. But certainly looking back, oftentimes when you ask, you know, surviving family and friends, they will often pinpoint various parts where the person was reaching out for help and support. Perhaps they didn't hit the nail on the head about how they were feeling or what they needed, for example. Whereas other times people had no clue at all. They just didn't understand why this had happened. And, you know, so-and-so always seemed to be bright and cheerful and positive. You know, so it really does vary, you know. Really,
and what we see outside is, you know, you can be thinking that people are, you know, living their lives and really happy, especially because you see a certain persona on social media, and actually there's, the reality is very different, isn't it? So the reality is very different. So just on, just wanted to sort of wrap up on the courses as well. So because we've got a bit of an offer for people as well, which is really great. But on the training courses you got on there, are they for people that are kind of working within the wellbeing sector, or is this people with the sort of mental wellbeing issues? Who are these kind of courses targeted at?
Yeah, so I've designed all of my courses, I think, except the one which is about how to be an expert witness. But all the other courses are designed so as to make them helpful to people working in health and social care services, but also people who are experiencing, for example, anxiety, PTSD, depression, and also family members who want to understand those issues better. So that they're good for a whole range of people.
Yeah, and there's a whole variety of courses on there. That's why I'm really excited about this offer. So for the mental health warrior community, you've said that you can get an offer that if they make contact over the next 7 days, that you can offer, is it 1,000 people one of the courses for free?
Yes. So after the show, I'll send you the links to 2 of the courses, and basically, if people click on those links and register within 7 days, after 7 days the links expire and you can't click on them. But I think it's up to 1,000 people. The first 1,000 people can then register totally free of charge, and they have lifetime access to the courses.
That's fantastic. So that's brilliant. So what I'll do is, you'll send me the details. I can then post on our LinkedIn, Facebook, YouTube, we'll post the details on there. And then if anyone's interested, I think the 2 courses are going to be the Introduction to Mental Health, wasn't it? Certificate, that one.
Yeah. And Introduction to PTSD perhaps would be helpful
as well. So I think that'd be really good. So Introduction to PTSD and General Mental Health. So we'll put all the details on the Mental Health Warriors social media platforms, and then you can click on those links and get that training for free, which is absolutely fantastic. So really appreciate you doing that, Kevin.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
So, I mean, thank you for your time. I'm going to wrap up now. It's been really interesting for me. Thank you for everyone that's had their comments and the chat, and for dialing in your time as well. So thanks to the community and for your engagement, and for anyone watching back as well. So it's been really fascinating for me, Kevin. So thank you. I really appreciate it.
Me too.
Brilliant.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I'm going to be, Hannah's going to be signing up, so she'll be one of your 1,000 there. I'm going to be back in a fortnight's time with the next show with an expert in EFT tapping. So she'll be talking us through how it all works, and also provide a bit of a taster demo as well. So that's the same time in a fortnight, 8 o'clock UK time. So I'm going to close the show now with the finishing video. So I'll just find that there, the end of the show. There it is. And just say thank you again to everyone for listening. Thank you.